The November rain fell in sheets, hammering against the wide glass windows of the café, turning the world outside into a blur of gray streets, rushing headlights, and umbrellas bent against the wind. Inside, warmth and light glowed like a secret haven. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon rolls, and maple syrup. But at the table in the far corner, the comfort of the place had no effect. James Mitchell sat hunched forward in a charcoal suit that looked perfect on his frame, yet carried the wrinkles of a man who had worn it too long without care. His head rested in his hands, his shoulders trembling with exhaustion. A steaming plate of golden pancakes sat untouched in front of his son, syrup pooling at the edges, melting butter running down in soft rivers. The boy, tiny and stiff in his press shirt, sat still as stone, staring through the plate as though it didn't exist. His lips barely moved, shaping words to faint for the world around him to hear. James lifted his face, and his eyes were raw, rimmed with red from weeks of sleepless nights. He reached across the table, voice breaking into the hush of the cafe. "Please, Tommy, just one bite. Anything. Mommy would want you to eat. She'd be so worried." His voice cracked, the desperation pulling something fragile from deep inside him. The boy didn't blink, didn't look at his father. He kept his little hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing. James leaned back, helpless, and for a moment he looked less like a millionaire and more like a man drowning in grief, unable to save the only thing left of his wife. On the other side of the glass, pressed against the rain-slicked window, Emma stood. She was 8 years old, but carried herself with a quietness that made her seem older. A shadow of experience far beyond her years painted across her thin face. Her sneakers were soaked through, leaving her toes cold and aching, and her oversized jacket hung loose on her shoulders like a heavy curtain, its hem brushing her knees. In her hand, she clutched a crumpled dollar bill she had found that morning in a grocery store parking lot, a treasure meant to buy her half a muffin if she was lucky. But her eyes weren't on the pastries lined in glass cases or the warm drinks carried by smiling baristas. Her gaze was fixed on the table in the corner, the man with his head in his hands, and the boy who would not eat. Emma recognized the stillness in the boy's face. She knew that kind of silence, the kind that wasn't just stubbornness, but the emptiness of grief so sharp it hollowed you out. She had lived it. She had carried it in her own small body after her mother was gone. Something stirred in her chest, something that pulled stronger than her hunger, stronger than the fear of stepping into a place where she did not belong. Before she could second-guess herself, she pushed the door open, and the soft chime of the bell cut through the cafe's murmur. Heads turned as she stepped in, dripping water onto the polished floor, shoes squeaking with each step. The warmth washed over her like a blanket, carrying with it the smell of coffee and cinnamon, but she did not pause. She kept her chin lifted, moving slowly toward the corner table. James looked up, startled by the sight of her this thin, bedraggled child with damp hair clinging to her forehead, cheeks flushed from the cold. His first instinct was to wave for someone, to send her away, but something in her eyes froze him. They were not begging eyes. They were steady, carrying a sadness that matched his own, a kind of wisdom no child her age should have to hold. She stopped beside their table, her voice quiet, yet clear enough to silence even the clinking of cups around them. "Your little boy, he's sad about his mommy, isn't he?" James stared, caught between disbelief and a strange pull to listen. "Yes," he managed, his throat tight. "She passed away 2 months ago. He won't eat. I don't know what to do anymore." Emma nodded slowly, her wet hair dripping onto her oversized jacket. She didn't flinch at his words, as if she had expected them. Her gaze shifted toward the boy, who had not looked at anyone for weeks, yet now tilted his head slightly toward her. Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "Meant for him alone. My mommy went to heaven too, but I learned something important. When mommies go away, they leave love in the food. Daddies have to learn the magic words, or the food just tastes empty." The cafe seemed to still, every sound fading into quiet. James felt his chest tighten, torn between disbelief and hope. As his son's small head turned toward the ragged girl, Tommy's lips parted, his voice a frail murmur. "Magic words." Emma leaned forward, her eyes shining, her voice carrying the weight of her mother's memory. Yes, magic words, for the first time in weeks. Tommy lifted his eyes not to the pancakes, not to the window, but to Emma, and in that moment, James realized something impossible had just happened. This little girl, a stranger in rags, had reached his son when no one else could. The next morning, the rain had not stopped. It poured steadily, as though the sky itself was still grieving, each drop striking the glass walls of James Mitchell's mansion. Like an unrelenting reminder of what was missing, the house was enormous, silent, and lifeless. The kind of place where polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers gleamed under soft light. But everything felt hollow. Rooms too large for comfort echoed with absence. In the kitchen, spotless stainless steel counters reflected a man who had built empires and conquered boardrooms, yet now stood powerless in front of a plate of food that no one would touch. James leaned on the counter, his fingers pressed into his temples, staring at Tommy, who sat stiffly in his chair. The boy had not moved, not spoken, not even blinked in response to his father's pleading. The untouched plate before him might as well have been invisible. It was the same as yesterday, the same as the day before. James's chest tightened with despair. He had built his wealth on control, on finding solutions where others saw walls. But here he was, trapped in a problem his money could not solve. His son was fading, and with him, James's last tie to the woman he had loved more than life itself. He was still standing there when a faint knock echoed through the cavernous hallway. It was soft, hesitant, almost too fragile to be real. He froze. No one knocked at his door. Delivery men buzzed at the gate. Business associates called ahead. Staff used their keys. But this sound, this delicate tapping, felt foreign in his world. He opened the door, and there she was, Tema, the bedraggled little girl from the café. Her jacket hung heavier now, damp from the endless rain. Her sneakers squelched on the steps, and in her small hand she clutched a grocery bag that looked too large for her to carry. For a long moment, neither spoke. James felt torn. This was his home, his fortress, the last place for strangers, and yet, when he looked down into Emma's eyes, he saw something that unsettled him. She was not afraid. She wasn't begging either. She simply stood there, rain dripping from her hair, holding her bag as though she had every right to be there. "I brought something," she said finally, her voice steady. He should have said no. He should have closed the door, called someone, drawn the lines between his life and hers. But before he could, Tommy's small voice came from behind him. So quiet it was nearly lost in the patter of rain. Magic words. The sound nearly broke James. His son had spoken without prompting, without begging, and it was to this little girl, not to him. He stepped aside without thinking, letting her in. The kitchen, usually cold and perfumed only by the emptiness of untouched meals, came alive in a strange way as Emma stepped onto the tile. She placed the grocery bag on the counter and began pulling out its meager contents. Half a loaf of bread, a small jar of honey, and a handful of bruised apples. James frowned. His own pantry was stocked with delicacies from around the world. Yet this girl carried scraps as if they were treasure. "You don't need to," he began. But Emma silenced him with a look far too steady for a child. "Food doesn't work without the words," she said. "That's why Tommy can't eat. Your house smells like nothing." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to dismiss her as a foolish child, but then she reached for a bowl, her small hands awkwardly pulling it toward her, and Tommy's eyes, as blank, distant eyes, followed her every move. James's throat tightened. He had not seen that look in weeks. Emma placed the bread on the counter and handed James the honey. "Say the words while you stir," she instructed. James stared at her, incredulous. "What words?" "Any words," she answered simply, "but they have to mean love." His hand shook as he opened the jar. He felt ridiculous. He, James Mitchell, one of the most powerful men in Seattle, reduced to whispering nonsense over bread and honey because a homeless child told him to. But when he glanced at Tommy, sitting straighter, watching with a flicker of interest, James realized he would do anything, absolutely anything, for even the chance of a change. He stirred slowly, his voice breaking as he forced the words out. "For you, Tommy, Mommy loves you, Daddy loves you, please eat." Emma nodded, satisfied, and spread the honey on the bread with her small hands. She placed the plate in front of Tommy without a word. The boy's hands trembled, his lips moving, soundlessly. For a long moment, the room was still, silent except for the rain beating against the windows. Then, almost impossibly, Tommy picked up the bread. He brought it to his mouth. He took a bite. James nearly collapsed. His knees buckled. His hand gripped the edge of the counter as tears blurred his vision. The sound of his son, chewing something, So small, so ordinary was the most extraordinary sound he had ever heard. Emma sat quietly beside Tommy, her face calm, almost serene, as though this was exactly how it was meant to be. James looked at her then, truly looked, and a strange, uneasy question settled in his chest. Who was this girl, really, and how could she possibly know the one thing that doctors, experts, and his own desperate heart could not? The rain carried on through the night and into the following morning, a steady rhythm against the glass walls of the Mitchell mansion. The house, vast and gleaming with polished marble and gold accents, seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. Even with lights burning in every corner, the air carried an emptiness that no wealth could fill. Yet something had shifted since Emma's first visit. For the first time in weeks, there was the faint sound of chewing, of a child's voice whispering, words so fragile they could vanish at any moment, and all of it had been sparked by a little girl in silk sneakers, who had carried scraps into a billionaire's kitchen. James didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the door cracked open, listening, terrified that if he closed his eyes, the fragile miracle would disappear. His son was asleep upstairs, and Emma, who had insisted she would leave after dinner, had curled up on the rug near the fireplace in the sitting room. She slept like a child who hadn't known comfort in a long time. Body curled tight, jacket still wrapped around her as though she feared losing even that. James had wanted to tell her she could use one of the guest rooms, but the words had caught in his throat. There was something about her, something that made him feel both protective and deeply unsettled. By dawn, he was pacing the kitchen when Emma pattered in, her hair tangled, her face pale from exhaustion. She didn't look at the chandelier above, or the expensive appliances gleaming around her. She moved with purpose, dragging a chair to the counter and reaching for a mixing bowl. James watched, baffled, as she pulled items from his pantry, not caviar or imported cheese, but the simplest ingredients: eggs, flour, milk. Her small hands moved with practiced motions, though clumsy at times, as though she had taught herself without guidance. "What are you doing?" he finally asked, unable to bear the silence. She didn't look up. "Tommy will only eat if it smells like love. Yesterday was bread and honey. Today should be pancakes." The words made his chest tighten. His wife, God. His wife had been famous in their home for her pancakes. She made them every Sunday morning, humming as she stirred the batter. He hadn't allowed anyone to make them since. Yet here was this child, speaking of it like she knew, like she had listened to his wife herself. His voice sharpened with suspicion. "Who told you that? About the pancakes?" Emma paused, the wooden spoon trembling in her hand, but her eyes never wavered. "No one told me. I just... No." James's heart clenched. He should have pressed harder. But then Tommy shuffled into the room, hair sticking up, eyes heavy from sleep. He froze when he saw Emma, his small frame stiff, but the moment the scent of batter filled the air, his expression flickered with something almost human again. Emma smiled softly, as though she had expected this. "Do you want to stir, Tommy?" she asked, her voice gentle. For weeks, the boy had ignored every question, every plea. Now, slowly, he reached for the spoon. His hands shook as he gripped it, but Emma covered them with her own, steadying him. James's throat burned as he watched. His son leaned into the motion, his lips moving almost soundlessly. "Mommy food," Emma whispered back. "Mommy's love. Daddy's love." Magic words. The boy's hand stilled, then resumed with more strength. It was only a spoon scraping against a bowl, but for James, it felt like the earth shifting. He turned away quickly, tears threatening to fall, but his mind screamed with questions. Who was this girl? How could she possibly know what to say, what to do, when even the finest doctors had failed? By the time the pancakes sizzled on the pan, James felt the edges of his control frame. He needed answers. He needed to know why a child from the streets had managed to pierce the darkness of his home. After breakfast, when Tommy was distracted, in the playroom, James led Emma into his study. The fire still burned low in the hearth, casting shadows across shelves lined with books and awards, reminders of the empire he had built. He closed the door behind them, the sound sharp in the silence. Emma stood small in the center of the room, her hands fidgeting with the sleeves of her jacket. But her eyes, though steady, sorrowful eyes, never left his. "Who are you, really?" James demanded, his voice low but urgent. "You walk into a café, you speak to my son like you've known him all your life, and suddenly he eats. Suddenly he talks. That doesn't just happen. Tell me the truth. Emma swallowed, her chin trembling. But she did not cry. I already told you. My mommy went to heaven. I don't have anyone else. James stepped closer, his towering presence casting her in shadow. Children don't just survive on the streets for years. Where do you sleep? How do you eat? And how? His voice cracked. How do you know the things you say? For the first time, Emma's mask slipped, her lips pressed tight, her small body shaking as though holding back words that wanted to burst free. Finally, she whispered, because I remember what it's like, sitting at a table, food in front of me, but it didn't taste right anymore. It didn't taste like mommy, and I got thinner and thinner until she broke off. Her shoulders curling and James froze, his anger dissolving into something else, horror, grief, recognition. She was describing Tommy's pain, word for word. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of rain against the glass. Then Emma lifted her face, and in her eyes James saw something that chilled him. She was carrying the same emptiness that had nearly consumed his son. She was not just helping Tommy, she was reliving her own loss through him. James sank into his chair, shaken to his core. He had no idea what frightened him more, the thought that she might vanish and take Tommy's fragile progress with her, or the possibility that letting her stay would uncover truths about grief and love that even he wasn't ready to face. The storm outside had softened by evening, but inside the mansion the air was heavy with a different kind of storm, quiet, invisible, yet more suffocating than thunder. For the first time in weeks, James had witnessed Tommy eat something more than a crumb, had heard his son's voice whisper "mommy food" without breaking down into silence. That small moment, so ordinary for any other family, had left him trembling like a man who had been dragged back from the edge of a cliff. And at the center of it all was the little girl now sitting at his kitchen table, her skinny legs swinging beneath the chair, her damp jacket folded on the backrest, her eyes fixed on the empty plate where the pancakes had once been. James had spent his entire life dismissing miracles as fairy tales. He had built his empire on numbers, contracts, leverage. If something could not be calculated, it did not exist. And yet here she was, this child from nowhere, working wonders in his home, where even professionals had failed. It rattled him. It frightened him. And yet, as much as he wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, he could not ignore the way Tommy's eyes now followed her, how his small body leaned toward her presence, like a plant straining for sunlight. But James was not a man who left questions unanswered. That night, long after Tommy had been tucked into bed and Emma had curled up again by the fireplace, James retreated to his study and opened his laptop. He scrolled through reports, news clippings, missing children databases. He typed in Emma, Seattle orphan again and again, hoping for a match, a face, a clue. Nothing. It was as though she didn't exist on paper at all. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, Emma was already in the kitchen when James descended the grand staircase. She was humming softly, her messy hair tied back with a piece of string, standing on tiptoe to reach the counter. She had pulled out flour and eggs again, but this time she was letting Tommy stir. James paused in the doorway, his breath catching. His son was smiling just barely, a ghost of a smile, but it was there, curling at the edge of his lips. Emma was whispering the magic words as he stirred, and Tommy was repeating them in his fragile, broken voice. It was too much for James. He stepped into the room, his voice low but charged. "What are you doing to him?" Emma froze, the wooden spoon clattering to the counter. Tommy stiffened, his eyes wide with fear at the sudden sharpness in his father's voice. James regretted it instantly, but he could not stop himself. He moved closer, towering over her small figure. "You come into my house, into my son's life, and suddenly he changes. You talk about magic words, about things only his mother used to say. How do you know all this? Who taught you?" Emma's chest rose and fell quickly, her small hands curling into fists at her sides. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked younger than her years, fragile, cornered, but her voice when it came was steady. "I know because I had to teach myself. My mommy didn't just cook food, she made it feel safe. After she died, I didn't eat for days. Nothing tasted right. Nothing smelled like love anymore. And one day I whispered the words into the food myself, just to pretend she was still there. And it worked." Her gaze flicked to Tommy, softening. "That's why I know, because I was him." The room went utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of rain against the glass and the ticking of the ornate clock above the stove. James stared at her, his throat tight, his mind warring with itself. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible, absurd. And yet, hadn't he just seen the impossible with his own eyes? Before he could respond, Tommy did something that broke the stalemate. He stood, carrying the half-stirred bowl in his tiny hands and placed it carefully on the counter. Then, without a word, he walked over to Emma and leaned his head against her arm. It was the first physical contact he had initiated. Since his mother's death, James felt his heart shatter. He had begged, pleaded, bribed, threatened, held his son in his arms while the boy was stiff with resistance, unable to respond. And now, here was this homeless orphan, cradling his son's broken heart with nothing but her presence. He stumbled back into the doorway, pressing a hand to his face, his breath ragged. When he finally lowered it, his eyes burned with something new and terrifying, not fear, because now he understood the truth. If Emma left, Tommy would collapse again. His son's fragile progress was tied to this child, and James didn't know how to hold on to her without breaking her, too. That night, as the storm finally gave way to a thin sliver of moonlight, James found himself standing by the fireplace, watching Emma sleep. She looked impossibly small, curled on the rug, the flames painting her face with gold and shadow. Tommy had insisted on sleeping beside her, his tiny body pressed against hers like a lifeline. And as James looked down at the two of them, an unsettling thought crept into his chest. He had brought her into his home for Tommy's sake. But what if Emma needed saving just as much as his son? The question haunted him into the night. And when dawn broke, bringing with it a phone call that would expose Emma's darkest secret, James realized the storm outside had only been the beginning. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the Mitchell mansion, the house was no longer silent in the way it had been for weeks. There was a rhythm now, the soft hum of Emma's voice, as she coaxed Tommy to stir pancake batter, the occasional clatter of spoons on counters, even the muffled laugh of a child rediscovering the taste of joy. Yet beneath that fragile peace, James Mitchell carried a storm inside him. He had spent half the night pacing the study, unable to shake the feeling that this child had stepped into his home, carrying more than her ragged clothes and haunted eyes. She carried secrets, and secrets had a way of unraveling everything. The phone call came just after sunrise. James had been sipping coffee, staring absently at the rain-streaked glass when his private line buzzed. The voice on the other end belonged to his driver, Carter, who had been asked quietly the night before to look into Emma's past. "Sir," Carter said cautiously, "we found her." James's chest tightened. "Where?" "Downtown. Abandoned lot behind a laundromat. Locals say she's been there for months, maybe longer. They've seen her digging through dumpsters, sometimes sleeping under the stairwell. No records of her in shelters, no school files, nothing. It's like she doesn't exist on paper." A pause, then softer. "She's been surviving alone, sir." James ended the call, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. He turned, and in the kitchen doorway, Emma stood with Tommy clinging to her side, eyes wide, as if she'd heard enough to know what the conversation was about. For the first time since she'd entered his life, she looked exposed, cornered. Her chin lifted, though, and her voice, though trembling, carried defiance. "You tried to find out about me." James exhaled sharply, guilt mixing with frustration. "What was I supposed to do? You walk into my life, into my son's life, and suddenly everything changes. You expect me not to ask questions. I need to know who you are." Emma's small hands tightened around Tommy's. The boy clutched her arm as the letting go meant losing breath itself. She swallowed hard. "I told you already. My mommy went to heaven. I've been alone since then. Nobody wanted me. Not the shelters. Not the families that came to look. They all said I was too quiet, too strange." Her eyes flickered down, her voice breaking. "So I stopped waiting for anyone to want me." The word struck James harder than any accusation. He had spent weeks drowning in his own grief, convinced his wealth meant nothing in the face of loss. But here was this child, stripped of everything, surviving in the shadows of his city without a name or a place in the world. And still, she found a way to give love to a boy who refused even to open his mouth. Before he could answer, Tommy tugged at Emma's sleeve. His small voice, thin but certain, broke the silence. "Don't go." The plea shattered something inside James. He had spent sleepless nights whispering those words into his son's ear, begging him not to drift further into silence, further. into that unreachable world of grief, and now Tommy had spoken them out loud for Emma. But the moment was cut short by another sound, the doorbell. It rang once, sharp and insistent. Then again, James's stomach sank. He wasn't expecting anyone, and few dared to come uninvited. When he opened the door, two sharply dressed women stood on the steps, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the mansion's opulent entryway with practiced detachment. Child Services. We received a report, one of them said briskly, about a minor currently in your residence. We'll need to speak with her. Behind him, Emma froze, her face pale, her body tensing like a trapped animal. Tommy whimpered and clutched her harder, burying his face in her side. James's pulse thundered. He had the resources to dismiss almost anyone from his door, but this was different. These were the people who decided where children belonged, and in that moment, he realized something with startling clarity. If they took her, his son would break again. The women stepped forward, but James's frame filled the doorway, his voice colder than they expected. This is not the time. Not in front of the children. One of them arched a brow, unshaken. Mr. Mitchell, it is exactly the time. The girl is not yours. We need to know how she ended up here. From behind him, Emma whispered, "Please, don't let them take me." The sound twisted like a knife in his chest. He looked back at her, this fragile, fierce child who had walked into his café and changed everything. His son's eyes, wide and terrified, locked on his, silently begging him to do what even a millionaire could not buy. Keep the only person who had broken through his grief. James turned back to the women, his jaw set. "You will not take her, not today, not from this house." The air bristled with tension. For the first time in years, James Mitchell was not negotiating business, not buying power, not protecting assets. He was fighting for something that no amount of money could measure, and in that moment, as Emma clung to Tommy and the rain battered against the glass, he knew the greatest battle of his life had only just begun. The mansion felt smaller that night, not because its walls had closed in, but because every corner of it carried tension thick enough to choke. James Mitchell sat in his study, the fire burning low, his fists clenched on the arms of his chair. The visit from Child Services earlier that day replayed in his mind, like a needle caught in a broken record. Two women, calm and professional, had arrived with clipboards and stern eyes, demanding to know why a ragged little girl with no legal guardian was living in his home. They had seen Emma's fear, seen Tommy's trembling arms clinging to her, and still, they had tried to separate them. James had sent them away, but not before catching the warning in their tone. "We'll be back." Upstairs, the quiet was broken only by the sound of children's breathing. Emma had insisted on sleeping on the rug beside Tommy's bed, her small hand wrapped around his like a lifeline. James had checked on them twice already. Each time, he found Tommy's face pressed against her shoulder, the deep, dreamless sleep of a boy who finally felt safe. It left James torn and too grateful for the miracle she brought into his son's life, yet terrified of how fragile it all was. When dawn came, James rose early, dressing not in his usual flawless suits, but in simple slacks and a sweater. He looked less like the polished millionaire who dominated boardrooms, and more like a man stripped to his bare humanity. He poured coffee in silence, but his thoughts were anything but still. He had fought mergers, outmaneuvered rivals, stared down billion-dollar lawsuits, yet nothing compared to the fight that was coming now. Because this wasn't about numbers, it was about two children, one his blood, one not, and the knowledge that both needed him in ways he hadn't been ready to admit. By mid-morning, the storm outside had returned, heavy and unyielding, when his lawyer, an older man named Dalton, arrived. Dalton's eyes narrowed the moment James explained, "You've let a homeless child live here, and now Child Services knows. James, they could accuse you of anything: harboring, negligence, even abduction. Your reputation, your business is damn." "The reputation," James snapped, slamming his fist against the desk. His voice cracked, not with anger, but desperation. "She saved my son. Do you understand that? Weeks of doctors, therapists, expensive specialists, and nothing. Then she walks into a cafe, and suddenly he's eating. He's talking again. She's the reason Tommy is still with me. If they take her, I lose him." Dalton studied him for a long moment, then sighed, pulling papers from his briefcase. "If you're serious, then you need to move quickly. Guardianship, adoption, something to put you on solid ground before they come back." The word adoption hung heavy in the air. James's breath caught. He hadn't even dared to think it. Yet hearing it spoken aloud made something in him shift. Could he take this girl, this stray child of the rain, and make her his own? He thought of her eyes haunted yet steady, the way she whispered magic words into food, the way Tommy leaned into her as though she were the only safe place left in the world. And in that moment, James knew the answer. He didn't just want to protect her for Tommy's sake. He wanted to protect her for hers. But Emma didn't know any of this. Later, as the children sat at the kitchen counter, Emma carefully peeling an apple for Tommy, James watched them in silence. She worked, slowly, patiently, handing Tommy slices one at a time as he chewed with the concentration of someone relearning how to live. Finally, James broke the quiet. Emma, he said softly, what if I could make sure no one could ever take you away from here? Her hands froze, the knife slipping slightly. She looked up, suspicion and longing warring in her gaze. Nobody can promise that, she whispered. I can, James said firmly, though inside his chest he was shaking. I can give you my name. I can give you a home, a family, not just for now, forever. The apple slice fell from her fingers. For a heartbeat she looked like a child again. Not the brave little survivor who had lectured him about love and food, but a girl terrified of hope. People don't keep me, she said, her voice breaking. They look at me, and then they change their minds. Emma. James leaned forward, his voice low but unshakable. I don't change my mind. I don't walk away. You have my word. Tears filled her eyes, but she shook her head violently, as if she couldn't risk believing him. Before James could reach for her, Tommy's small hand tugged at hers. Stay, he whispered. Please stay. That simple plea broke through where James's promises could not. Emma's tears spilled, and she nodded, clutching Tommy's hand as though it anchored her to the world. But the moment shattered that evening when headlights swept across the driveway, and the sharp knock came again at the front door. James's stomach dropped. Child Services had returned, this time with more authority in their stance, more determination in their voices. Mr. Mitchell, we're here for the girl. Behind him, Emma's small voice trembled. Don't let them. Tommy clung to her, crying openly now, his tiny frame shaking, and James, the man who had once believed his fortune could solve any problem, stood in the doorway with a storm in his chest fiercer than the one raging outside. For the first time in years, he wasn't protecting his wealth, his name, or his empire. He was protecting the children who had become his entire world. Over my dead body, he said, his voice low, his jaw set like steel, and as the women exchanged uneasy glances, realizing this was no ordinary case, the true battle for Emma and for Tommy's fragile hope began. The storm outside roared as though the heavens themselves had joined the fight. But the storm inside James Mitchell's mansion was far more dangerous. The two women from Child Services stood firm in the doorway, clipboards in hand, their professional detachment sharpened into something colder now. Behind them, the wind carried sheets of rain across the stone steps, soaking their coats. But they didn't flinch. Mr. Mitchell, one of them said, her tone clipped, you're obstructing state authority. The girl has no legal guardian. She cannot remain here. James's body filled the doorway, every inch of him radiating defiance. His jaw was set, like iron, his eyes blazing. She's not just a girl. Her name is Emma, and she's under my roof. She saved my son when no one else could. You're not taking her. Behind him, Emma stood trembling, clutching Tommy as the boy wept into her jacket. She looked so small, so fragile, yet her chin was lifted, as if she were ready to bolt into the storm. If it meant keeping Tommy safe, James turned slightly, catching the terror in her eyes, and in that instant something inside him snapped. He had spent months drowning in grief, paralyzed by loss, clinging to his son, but watching him slip further and further away. And then Emma had walked into their lives like a ghost sent from heaven, carrying with her the one thing money could not buy, hope. He wasn't going to let the system crush that. The women shifted, sensing the rising tension. Mr. Mitchell, refusal will have consequences. We can return with law enforcement. Please, don't make this harder than it already is. James took a step forward, forcing them back onto the rain-slick steps. His voice dropped to a growl, not of anger, but of unshakable resolve. Then bring whoever you want. Bring the police, bring your superiors. But understand this, Emma isn't leaving this house unless she chooses to. And I swear to God, I will fight you with every ounce of power I have." The storm swallowed their retreating footsteps, the sound of the door slamming behind them echoing. Like a gavel, James leaned against the heavy oak, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. For a long moment, the only sound inside was Tommy's sobs muffled against Emma's shoulder. That night, the mansion became a fortress. James didn't return to his study or his bed. He sat awake in the hall outside Tommy's room, listening to the children breathe, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the shadows. His mind raced with possibilities: legal battles, public exposure, the media tearing apart his private grief if the story broke. He had spent his life wielding power in the corporate world, but now he was learning the truth. Real power wasn't in contracts or bank accounts. It was in the promise he had made to two children who had no one else. At dawn, he called Dalton, his lawyer, and gave an order that stunned even the seasoned attorney. File for emergency guardianship today and file adoption papers immediately after. James, Dalton cautioned, "This isn't simple. They'll fight it. They'll question everything about Emma's background. You don't even know her last name. Then we'll give her mine." James said without hesitation, "Mitchell. She belongs here." The day became a whirlwind. Papers were drawn, signatures given, hearings expedited under James's influence. His name carried weight in the city. But this time, he wasn't using it to close a deal, he was using it to build a family. Meanwhile, Emma sat silently at the kitchen table, Tommy pressed against her side, watching James pace with phone in hand, his voice low and urgent. She didn't understand the details, but she understood enough. Men in suits had tried to take her away before. None had fought for her, until now. By evening, they were summoned to court. The room was stark, sterile, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. A judge sat high above, her gaze sharp as she flipped through the file hastily assembled by Dalton. On one side of the courtroom sat the child services representatives, their arguments polished and professional. On the other side, James sat in his charcoal suit, Tommy curled in his lap, Emma holding his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The arguments unfolded in tense waves. "Mr. Mitchell has no legal claim," one woman pressed. "The girl has no documented identity. She needs state protection, not a grieving father's impulsive rescue." James rose to his feet, his voice thunderous in the chamber. "Impulsive? She has given my son what months of doctors, therapists, and so-called experts could not." She brought him back from the edge. "She is not a stranger, she is family. And I will not stand here and let you treat her like a case file." The judge's gavel cracked once, silence in the room. She studied James, then turned her gaze to Emma. "Child," she said gently, "do you want to stay with Mr. Mitchell?" The courtroom fell into a silence so thick it seemed to still the very air. Emma's small voice, steady despite the tremor in her body, carried across the room. "I don't want to be anywhere if it's not with him, or with Tommy. We're supposed to be together." Even the court reporter looked up, her fingers pausing on the keys. Tommy, as if to prove her words, tightened his arms around her and whispered into the silence, "Stay." The judge's eyes softened. She tapped her pen thoughtfully, then leaned forward. "Sometimes the law must bend to what is right. This is one of those times." The gavel struck again, and James's chest broke open with a flood of relief. Guardianship was granted, with adoption to follow pending further review. The system had not been defeated, it had been convinced, for once, to listen to love over protocol. When they returned to the mansion that night, the storm had finally passed. The air outside was clear, the city lights glittering like 1,000 candles. Inside, the kitchen filled with the scent of pancakes once more. Emma sat at the table, Tommy beside her, and James stood over the stove, his hands clumsy, but his heart steady as he repeated the words she had taught him. Mommy's love, Daddy's love, family love. As he placed the plates before them, Tommy took a bite without hesitation, chewing thoughtfully before breaking into a smile, a real, unguarded smile that lit his face for the first time in months. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't born of fear or grief. They were born of something she had long ago stopped believing in: belonging. James sat with them, his voice low as he whispered the final words that sealed their bond. "You are mine now, both of you, forever." And in that moment, the mansion, once a hollow monument to wealth and loss, became what it had never been before: a home.